The advance payment for the Pika Pika block at Waitara had been made, but the sale was not final. The boundaries of the land had to be cut, the land surveyed, and a final price agreed on. The hapu of Waitara were preparing to meet any attempt to advance the sale, and every day of summer people were waiting between New Plymouth and Waitara to provide advance warning of any surveying party, and delay any party until the people of Waitara were prepared to prevent the survey. But Robert Parris continued to drag his feet over completing the sale, awaiting the return of Donald McLean to New Plymouth. However, McLean was in no hurry to participate in the sale, and was staying well outside of the province. It was Te Manuka and his supporters that got things moving along. On the 19th of January he wrote to Governor Gore Brown, "Mr. Parris says that it lies with the Governor to consummate our marriage with the beautiful woman Waitara, with the land which we have given up to you. Give your consent at my request. We are sad, because of our marriage with this woman being deferred so long. This woman that we gave to you in the face of day is now lying cold. You had better turn her towards you and warm her, that she may sleep comfortably in the middle of the bed." It is uncertain when this letter reached the Governor, but on the 25th of January the Governor called a meeting of the Executive Council to discuss how to deal with the purchase of Waitara. The 6 men present agreed that the purchase would go forward immediately, and that any attempt to interfere would be met with military force, and the land would be occupied by soldiers until settlers could take possession of the land. A number of letters were sent immediately after the meeting, making the decisions clear. Firstly, the Governor wrote a dispatch to the Duke of Newcastle, the British Secretary of State for the Colonies. The title of Taylor and the other proprietors having since then been proved and extinguished, and a large instalment of the purchase money having been paid, I have directed the survey to be made in the usual manner. Rumours have reached me that the survey will be interrupted by the Chief William King, who has evidently been advised by some disaffected person, and that difficulties may ensue. I do not put much faith in these rumours or anticipate resistance when the natives see that, though always ready to consider every reasonable objection, I am not the least determined to enforce Her Majesty's right to deal with her own subjects without hindrance from any one not having a legitimate interest in the transaction. I have, however, taken every precaution and made preparations for any contingency which may arise. The Governor also wrote to Colonel Gold, who commanded the British forces in New Zealand. This was largely a formality since Gold was one of the 6 men present for the Executive Council meeting, therefore the message was brief. I have the honour to forward an extract of the minutes recorded in the Executive Council held 25th of January 1860, and request you to give such instructions as you may deem necessary to the officer commanding Her Majesty's troops at New Plymouth, to enable him to carry into effect the views and wishes of the Executive Council. A proclamation enabling the officer commanding at New Plymouth to declare martial law, and power to call out the militia we forwarded by first mail to Colonel Murray direct. Colonel Murray was the officer in command at New Plymouth, and the Governor was giving this man significant authority to bring against any opposition to the purchase of Waitara. William Richmond, the Native Affairs Minister and the MP for the town of New Plymouth, wrote to Paris telling him to complete the survey. The survey is to be commenced in the first instance, without any display of force, by a surveyor attended only by an ordinary survey party, all being unharmed. You yourself being present on the ground, or not, as may seem expedient. You are to take care that the intended commencement of the survey is publicly known, and in particular that William Kingi and his party are made fully aware of it, and of the firm determination of His Excellency to complete the purchase. You will, however, avoid any official or formal announcement which might wear the aspect of an irritating challenge to the opposing party. Should resistance be made to the survey party will retire, and you are then to intimate to Lieutenant Colonel Murray that the assistance of a military force has become necessary. Military possession of the block will thereupon be taken and kept by the forces under command of Lieutenant Colonel Murray. Edward Stappet, the Colonial Secretary, was the one to write to Murray. The most important part of his message was the proclamation of martial law. By His Excellency, Colonel Thomas Gore Brown, Companion of the Most Honourable Order of the Bath, Governor and Commander-in-Chief in and over Her Majesty's Colony of New Zealand and its dependencies, and Vice-Admiral of the same, etc. Whereas active military operations are about to be undertaken by the Queen's forces against natives in the province of Taranaki in arms against Her Majesty's sovereign authority, now, I, the Governor, do hereby proclaim and declare that martial law will be exercised throughout the said province from publication hereof within the province of Taranaki until the relief of the said district from martial law by public proclamation. This proclamation was dated the 25th of January, but would not be actioned until Lieutenant Colonel Murray decided to publish it. When enacted, this proclamation would enable the British Army to take over the ordinary functions of law courts, effectively making Murray or Gold the dictator of the province. These letters reached New Plymouth in early February. On the 11th, Murray replied acknowledging the orders received and asserting that the 200 soldiers available to him would be sufficient to occupy the disputed land, but not to defend the town of New Plymouth as well. He requested an additional 50 soldiers and asked for better artillery pieces. Meanwhile, Paris was making preparations for the survey. On the 18th, George Cutfield, the superintendent of the province, issued a public notice. All persons are earnestly requested not to visit Waitara on Monday next, as a surveying party will proceed there on that day for the purpose of surveying the new block of land, and the presence of private individuals on that occasion would cause irritation among the natives. On Monday the 20th, Paris and a small party set out for Waitara. When he arrived, he was met by a group of 70 or so Maori. When the Pākehā tried to unpack the surveying equipment, the Maori attempted to obstruct them. The obstruction was intentionally minimalist. They did not even raise their voices at the surveyors. The surveyors eventually managed to get their chain unpacked to begin measuring the land, but the Maori successfully managed to prevent them using the chain. It was at this point that Hemi Pātaka, one of Te Tea's supporters who had accompanied the surveyors, had enough and knocked one of the obstructors to the ground. Paris quickly intervened before the violence could escalate, and the survey party withdrew. Arriving back in New Plymouth, Paris wrote a brief message to Lieutenant Colonel Murray. I have the honour to inform you that on arriving at Waitara this morning with the surveying staff for the purpose of surveying the block of land sold to the government, we were met by a party of from 60 to 80 of Wiramukingi's natives, who refused to allow us to proceed with the work. I have now the honour to intimate to you, in accordance with my instructions from the government, that the assistance of a military force has become necessary. Murray was now responsible for ensuring that the survey went ahead, but he did not force the issue immediately. He wrote to Kingi, William King, it has given me much pain to hear from Mr. Paris that the government surveyors sent down to survey the land purchased from Te Kohia were stopped by your people. This is rebellion against the Queen. I am most anxious that no harm should come to any Maoris caused by your conduct, but I must tell you plainly that the governor has ordered me to take possession of the land with soldiers, and I must obey him if you continue in opposition. As I wish to keep everything peaceable between the Europeans and the natives, I will wait till 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon for your answer, whether I am to go or not. Wiramukingi missed the deadline. The letter had only reached his home at 2 in the afternoon, and he was out until evening. He still replied, though. You say that we have been guilty of rebellion against the Queen, but we consider we have not, because the governor has said he will not entertain offers of land which are disputed. The governor has also said that it is not right for one man to sell the land to the Europeans, but that all people should consent. You are now disregarding the good law of the governor and adopting a bad law. This is my word to you. I have no desire for evil, but, on the contrary, have great love for the Europeans and Maoris. I have heard that you are coming to Waitara with soldiers, and therefore I know that you are angry with me. Is this your love for me, to bring soldiers to Waitara? This is not love, it is anger. I do not wish for anger. All that I want is the land. All the governors and the European have heard my word, which is that I will hold the land, that is all. Write to me, peace be with you. Murray did not write back to Kingi, but on the 22nd of February published a declaration of martial law that had been given to him earlier. This proclamation had an immediate impact on the Pākehā community in New Plymouth. Many of the settlers outside the town began moving into the town so they could be protected by the military. Plans were also made for the creation of 2 small fortifications, one a short distance to the west of town at Omata, and the other a short distance to the east on the Bell Block. However, this proclamation did not have the effect of causing Kingi and his supporters to cease resistance to the sale. This was partly because of flaws in the translation of the proclamation into Maori. The contemporary back translation reads, Because soon will be commenced the work of the soldiers of the Queen against the natives of Taranaki, who are naughty fighting against the authority of the Queen. Now, I, the Governor, do openly publish and proclaim this word, that the fighting law will extend at this time to Taranaki as a fixed law until the time when it shall be revoked by proclamation. Clearly the meaning of martial law had not translated over to Maori very well. Instead, this reads like a declaration of war, that the soldiers are about to commence work and the fighting law will come into effect. Even worse, neighbouring iwi and hapu were wondering if they were included in this declaration of war. The proclamation had stated that the fighting law would be a fixed law over the whole of Taranaki, therefore including Taranaki, Ngāti Ranui and other iwi, as well as the Te Atiawa within its bounds. With martial law in effect, the government forced through the deed of sale of the land at Waitara. On the 24th, the deed was signed by 19 Maori. The land was sold for £600, although the extra £500 probably wasn't ever paid. This deed was never formally submitted to the government. It was probably illegal since it didn't put aside any land for reserves, but it did provide a greater degree of legitimacy for the government's actions. Having said that, Murray chose to do nothing until reinforcements arrived. These reinforcements arrived at the start of March. 200 infantrymen, 2 24-pounder howitzers, and the 14-gun steam corvette HMSS Niger. The Taranaki Herald described their arrival. The steamer was observed in the distance to be crowded with human beings, but the prevailing colour of their dresses, scarlet, could not be discerned until the vessel neared the anchorage. Great was the delight and profound the feeling awakened by the spectacle, so much so that the governor's flag was not noticed from the shore, and His Excellency landed in the bustle almost unrecognised. Later in the day, HMSS Niger anchored from Auckland, and we are encouraged to believe that the powerful reinforcements by the two vessels will show the natives the folly of persisting in their misconduct, as well as disabuse their minds of any hope they may cherish of receiving support from other tribes. With the reinforcements came Colonel Gold to take command of the military forces, and Governor Gore Brown to take overall command. Gore Brown's first action was to invite Kingi to New Plymouth to discuss how best to resolve the situation. I hereby pledge my word that William Kingi and any reasonable number of his followers who may choose to come to New Plymouth unarmed and converse with, shall be allowed to return unharmed and in freedom to the place from whence they came. This promise shall be good from this day until the night of the 3rd of March, 1860. Paris and the two other men were sent to deliver this message, and after some difficulty found Kingi in inland forests. They talked at length, but Kingi wanted to reflect on his options. On the 2nd of March he replied to the governor. He wasn't willing to go to New Plymouth, but he would meet halfway, near the boundary between Pākehā and Maori land. Gore Brown did not take this negotiation well. His letter in reply, which is nothing but a mockery and a subterfuge to obtain time until he can get assistance. March the 5th was when the British Army marched to Waitara. The column set out at 4 a.m. with 20 mounted volunteers leading 2 howitzers and over 300 infantrymen. They arrived at Waitara around noon to find the British flag already flying over William Kingi's village. The Niger had reached Waitara earlier and found it abandoned. The soldiers occupied a position dominating the disputed land and began entrenching themselves. They were fearful of a night attack, but this didn't come. Instead, a small force of Te Atiawa had constructed a small pa blocking the road between Waitara and New Plymouth. This pa was occupied by about 40 people, led by a man named Hapuruna. From this position they watched as the village of Kuhikuri was burnt by Te Tere's supporters. When the first supply column came along the road, Te Atiawa asked for the contents of the supply carts as compensation, but ultimately they allowed the convoy to pass. But the governor would not allow his supply lines to be threatened in this way. To the chief who obstructs the Queen's Road, you have presumed to block up the Queen's Road, to build on the Queen's land, and to stop the free passage of persons coming and going. This is levying war against the Queen. Destroy the places you have built, ask my forgiveness, and you shall receive it. If you refuse, the blood of your people be on your own head. I shall fire upon you in 20 minutes from this time if you have not obeyed my order. The pa was abandoned 10 minutes after receiving this notice and was destroyed by British troops. Gore Brown returned to New Plymouth, afraid that New Plymouth was undefended from an attack in revenge for the burning of Kuhikuhi. The town had a garrison of only 26 soldiers and 300 militia. 2 of the guns from HMS Niger were used to strengthen the defences. There were rumours that warriors were arriving to assist Kingi from other iwi. Paris was sent to find the truth of these rumours. He found that 300 warriors of the Taranaki iwi had arrived to assist Kingi. However, around this time about 110 Maori volunteered to fight for the government. At this time the two armies were very unbalanced. There were approximately 600 warriors in support of Kingi, while the government had 400 or so professional soldiers and sailors, 300 militiamen and volunteers, and 110 allied Maori warriors. Along with numerical superiority, the British had heavy artillery, which Kingi's supporters did not. In regards to small arms, the balance also favoured the colonial forces. The militia and Maori used very similar weapons, generally smooth-bore muzzle-loading muskets, although the militia had better gunpowder and musket balls, giving them better accuracy but a lower rate of fire, compounded by the Maori use of double-barreled guns on occasion. However, the Imperial soldiers and sailors and the settler volunteers used the more modern pattern 1853 musket rifle. It had a slightly slower rate of fire, but was effective out to 800 metres compared to the 50 metres of the muskets. There was a quiet for a short time while both sides prepared for the conflict. The government fortified their positions at New Plymouth and Waitara, while Kingi gathered allies and supplies for the conflict. The soldiers had noticed that the Maori were stockpiling timber near the disputed land. Gore Brown and Gold correctly predicted that this would be used to construct a pa on the disputed land. Gore proposed waiting for the pa to be completed and occupied, and then surround it so the conflict could be completed in a single battle. While waiting, the survey went ahead and was completed on the 14th without obstruction. It was on the night of the 15th that Kingi's supporters finally constructed their pā. This was on the southeast corner of the block of land and came to be known as Te Kohia by the Maori and pā by the British, based on its shape from when seen from above. This pā was occupied by Hapuruna and about 70 Te Atiawa warriors who proceeded to clear firing lines around the pā and remove the survey places close to the pā. Gold did not respond immediately. He instead requested artillery to be transported from New Plymouth and only began to move against Te Kohia on the 17th. On that day he moved a force of 306 soldiers, sailors and volunteers with 3 howitzers and a rocket tube to a position 750 yards from the pā. Robert Parris was sent to the pā to request Hapuruna's surrender, but Hapuruna refused to accept the message. The artillery opened a barrage which lasted for half an hour. Gold then moved his forces to within 300 yards of the pā to try and create a breach in the walls. At this point Hapuruna's force returned fire, but this was well beyond the effective range of muskets, and the fire was ineffectual. The defenders soon realised this and stopped firing, although the artillery continued to bombard the pā. After an hour without any fire from the defenders, some of the volunteer cavalry started to suspect that they had snuck out of the pā. 3 cavalry volunteers decided to rush forwards and attempt to grab the defenders' flag in between the artillery fire. 2 of them reached the palisade outside the pā, but the defenders were still there. The defenders fired a volley. Remarkably, the first 2 cavalrymen were unharmed, while the third behind them was shot from his horse and seriously wounded. The 2 unharmed escaped with a portion of the flag which they had managed to grab, but the third was left behind. A small group of soldiers and sailors ran forward to rescue the injured volunteer. One of them was Private William Corbett of the 65th Regiment, was killed and another wounded. The wounded volunteer cavalryman would later die of his wounds. After this brief exchange, the firing continued through the afternoon and into the night. The British troops began entrenching their positions to protect against a night attack, while Hapuruna's force was content to skirmish with the soldiers from near their pā. At daylight, the British continued their bombardment and continued to move the heavy guns forward. Eventually they were firing into the pā from only 50 yards away, and they were finally able to breach the palisades. The British infantry rushed into Te Kohia and found that it had been abandoned overnight. At the time, the British and settlers considered Te Kohia to be a victory, although a disappointing one. The British army had taken the ground and driven Te Atiawa from Waitara, but they were not able to destroy the military might of the iwi. The Taranaki Herald of the 24th of March captures the feeling of the settlers. Their correspondence at Waitara describes the aftermath of the bombardment of the pā. In these, fragments of shells, whole shells used as solid shot and grape shot were found scattered about. As it is positively known that there was not less than 80 men in the pā when it was attacked, it may be assumed that the casualties are not inconsiderable. But elsewhere in that issue their frustration shows. Amidst a continuous fire from artillery, rockets and small arms, the pā was silenced and surrounded. The rebels gave themselves up for lost. Crouched underground to avoid the withering fire above, they could offer little or no resistance. Nothing apparently remained for them but submission or death. But it was decreed otherwise. During the night, besiegers impatient for their prey were withdrawn, and 100 rebels walked out unopposed and unwatched at dawn of day. Even Gore Brown didn't try to pass this off as a total victory. But though I denuded Auckland and Wellington of protection and brought every soldier I could collect, embodying in a militia every able-bodied man in this province, the Maoris entertain but small respect for our numbers, and believe that they cannot or will not be increased. A pā which they erected in one night, and which was garrisoned only by about 70 Maoris, occupied our troops for 2 days to capture and destroy. A storm of shot and shell did scarcely any execution, and finally it was evacuated with trifling loss. However, the full consequence of this battle was not appreciated by the settlers. Firstly, not a single member of Te Atiawa was killed in this battle. A number were wounded, but the most serious injury was a broken arm. The bombardment had been ineffective because the pā had been built with deep anti-artillery bunkers and lined with flax bundles to absorb musket ball and shrapnel. But more importantly, this battle had given Te Atiawa a huge diplomatic victory. Firstly, the British had fired first. They could now say that it was the governor that had started the fighting. And secondly, the volleys they fired, well beyond effective range, were not intended to kill British or volunteer soldiers, but was instead to demonstrate that they had defended their own land and had not simply allowed the governor to take Waitara. From the perspective of Hapuruna, the battle had been a total victory by mid-afternoon, and had given Te Atiawa a great diplomatic platform with which to approach the other iwi that might be convinced to come to Te Atiawa's aid. The first example of this came in the following days, with more warriors from Taranaki and Ngāti Ranui coming to assist. But perhaps most telling is that one of the chiefs that had pledged support for the governor defected and joined Kingi's side. It was clear to everyone that this conflict was not over.